Thank you so much, Bogdan. So yes, so far it's been a very kind of a there's been a curriculum and helping you design a project and think through some of the things. Kateryna and I wanted to kind of approach it from a bit of a different angle and really show, the messiness of having to design a computational social science project. There are we have designed many projects, and there are things that have really worked, and there are things in which we have failed and how we have come out of it. And at the same time, with the publishing as well, it's really easy to look at someone's CV and think, oh, they're so accomplished, they published so many papers. But in fact, every publication can be challenging, and sometimes you get desk rejects. And so how to approach this messiness and how to not lose faith in the methods when they become hard, this is basically what our session today is about. So a little bit of who we are. Kateryna and I met at the Summer Institute in Sydney in 2022. So we are wearing our vintage t-shirts now. We have been collaborating for 4 years. This is our probably anniversary because it happens in June every year. So we've been collaborating for 4 years. We have 3 journal articles that we've published in common, 1 book chapter, 2 conference papers, 7 something conference presentations. We've lost count. We've also made some NTROs, which are non-traditional research outputs. So things like op-eds, podcasts, we've done those more than once as well. And we are very proud to announce that our intercoder reliability, our Krippendorf alpha, is always at around 0.75%, which is gold standard. But as Arabi warned us yesterday, it doesn't mean that we're unbiased. It might mean that we are both biased in the same way. But yes, we are very reliable coders. So that is something we are particularly proud of throughout our collaboration. We've also engaged with various computational methods. So maybe Kateryna would like to tell you about them.
Of course, yes. I'll also give you a little bit of the context on the dogs that you will see. You may also spot them on Olga's socks if you look carefully. So Olga and I started collaborating because we were both interested in this large and global online collective that emerged during Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And we've addressed that topic and other topics of research through combining multiple methods. We are computational social scientists, so we work comfortably, rather, with digital trace data. At the time when we met, that was still Twitter. It was still called Twitter, and it had an academic API, which allowed us to collect quite a lot of posts, numbering in millions. We looked at other platforms as well and did comparative research comparing multiple platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, in particular. Of course, we've done text classification, looking at not only how certain issues are represented, but what do people do with the language, right? So approaching it from a practice theoretical perspective and looking at discourse practices or behaviors rather than just representations. We've also encountered and analyzed a lot of image data, using some methods that we'll tell you a little bit about, but also you'll learn about them later in the Summer Institute. We both love network analysis. We approach it in productively different ways, which is always great. We've tried and successfully finished a semi-automated literature review in an upcoming edited volume on social media, Routledge Companion to Social Media and Politics. That's coming out very soon. We've also done author-ethnography for both of us. We looked at the digital traces of our WhatsApp chat and our emails as well. Some studies also call it friendship as method. But yes, this is something that we've achieved so far. And yes, the images are actually a practice of the collective that we studied, which is NAFO, the North Atlantic Fellow Organization, who remain semi-anonymous. But they distinguish each other by having this dog avatar that they customize with objects that represent them. So on the left, that's Olga, and on the right, that's me. We both, so usually a person would get an avatar for themselves and they would say, I want this and that, I want these objects. But in my case, I've actually requested an avatar for Olga and she did that for me. So that's how we see each other, I suppose, in terms of the objects that represent us as well, in all their complexity. Yeah.
Yes, so this is our positionality statement. We're both Ukrainian. We joined our interest in online activism and values and motivations that drive online activism at the backdrop of violent conflicts. For us, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine started, obviously that was a major event that we thought we saw a lot of very interesting stories that we wanted to tell. And that is something that brought us to NAFO as an object of study. We've also done a few other projects, so our work is not limited to NAFO, but as a positionality statement, also acknowledging that we had been members of this collective, the collective that we're studying as part of our kind of, practice.
All right, so there is a reason why we're doing this session early into the Institute. Multiple reasons, but the main one is that sometimes it's important to think about the outputs in the beginning. We'll tell you the reasons as well and why that might be useful and why you might give it an early thought. One way to look at it is maybe in a more computational speak, it's a reverse engineering process, right? So you start with the outcome and then you think about the ways to get you there. So let's start thinking about that now. I hope you can read this because this is hopefully funny, but this is a webcomic called XKCD. It's very nerdy. Some of you might be familiar with it. I love it very much. So this is a meme or a comic about the types of scientific paper. And it kind of laughs at the type of things that scholars might be publishing. We scan some undergraduates. That's a pretty common one, right, to do, especially in certain countries and in certain disciplines. Check out this weird thing one of us saw while out for a walk. I'd love to write that paper. Some thoughts on how everyone else is better at research. You probably have a section titled something like that in your thesis, I dare say, and you should have a section on that. The task that I had to do anyway turned out to be hard enough for its own paper. That's actually quite a good paper, and you might end up writing that one. I think Olga already flagged it yesterday in prompting you to question, is this a methods paper, right? So sometimes that might be that one. But we write some of those as well, right, Olga? So which ones do we write?
We do, and we actually once even had check out this weird thing one of us saw on the walk, because whenever we encounter a Shiba Inu dog, we are obligated to take a photo and send it to the other person, and that's how it works.
If you go to the next slide, we'll tell you which ones we actually do. So what are fish even doing down there? Not really about fish, but we are very interested in what people do online, in online communities, on digital platforms. So that's one type. The task I had to do anyway turned out to be hard enough for its own paper. And hey, at least we showed that this method can produce results. That's not nothing, right? That's your method paper.
This is literally the session. At least we showed that this method can produce results.
So here we go. That's what we actually write, though.
Yeah, so those are our papers. They are in various ways approaching activism, kind of engaging with the key theories of activism, key promises, surveying some of the kind of canon of activism and seeing whether we're seeing something new. But also we're increasingly looking at overall what are some of the behaviors that that users are engaging with regard to the war online, and that's our repertoire of our collaborative action. This is also a type of papers that we write, and as you would see, these are coming from different disciplines. Yes,
and actually, maybe now will be a good time to tell you or ask you if you know the difference between a paper and an article. Does anyone know what the difference is? Does anyone have a German supervisor who's very precise about their language? I do. So, okay, a paper is something that's in a conference, an article is something that's in a journal. And that if you want to be precise about how you call these things, you might distinguish them in that way. Not everybody does. My supervisor, whom I love dearly, and it's wonderful to work with someone who's precise with their language, taught me that's the difference, okay? So these would probably be papers then rather than articles. And what we showed you before were articles. This one is by me and my PhD supervisors. It was in a conference, which was called EMNLP, Empirical Methods in Natural Language Processing. It's an A-star conference, and we'll tell you a little bit about that. But for me, writing this was about navigating this very different disciplinary conventions, naming, rankings, and other things.
And software.
And software,
because our colleagues in science write their papers in Overleaf, which is maybe some of you might be familiar with, but this is a very different game from Microsoft Word. We like to make fun of each other lovingly about our preference for certain software, but this is definitely also a new kind of, you're venturing into a pretty different space than what we're used to in the social sciences.
For me, it actually started with learning how to pronounce. So Overleaf is a software that you use, but the format is called LaTeX, but it's spelled latex. Okay, so that's already confusing and gatekeepy. It's actually quite fun, and I recommend learning how to use it because it's good at formatting things, right? And it will do a lot of things for you automatically, but it really takes some getting used to. And I remember someone at SICSS Sydney who was talking about interdisciplinary collaboration said that, please do not show me another, or do not add me to another LaTeX template or another sort of Overleaf document.
Yes, export things in PDF and send it my way if you want my opinion on the review. So yeah, there are many conventions of collaborating with colleagues across disciplines that might work for you.
Can you tell us your experience?
So this is a paper that we're actually, it's undergoing its second round of revisions, this mesoscale structures in signed networks. I mentioned this project a little bit previously. This was about kind of interrogating the assumption of assortativity when you generate a network and trying to look at various forms and structures of network. And then this one was done with colleagues in computer science. This was looking at orchestrated influence operations at scale and trying to design very much an alternative way of identifying orchestrated coordination. So the topics can be different, and sometimes it might be the case that we bring subject matter expertise to these collaborations. Sometimes it might be that you bring technical methods expertise, and in every case the writing conventions are also slightly different, and it's just really interesting to navigate this landscape. But might be a good idea to point early on. So if we encourage you to start from the outputs when you are collaborating with someone, be really clear about kind of the venues that you are aiming with your project, because it is often the case that what is useful for you is maybe less useful for your collaborator, and vice versa. Kateryna will talk more about it in.
Right, absolutely. And even with this one, right? So it's a computational paper. It's about, again, I'm interested in identifying user practices or things that people do online. In this particular case, we've developed a way of doing that with large language models. So trying to identify intention or action behind language in online communities, and also capturing their unique vernacular ways of doing these things, right? So the practices that are distinct to their communities, and we compared fans of Eurovision and NAFO, the collective that we told you earlier about. Again, this was mainly an output that seemed meaningful to my external supervisors who were computational linguists. They suggested the venue for me. I had to get familiar with the process of, they are computational linguists, so their field has this process of rolling review. So there are several conferences that all collaborate together. And then what you do is you don't really submit to a conference or a paper, you submit to that rolling review, and then they look at it, and then you get reviewer feedback. If it's a positive one, you can submit it to a conference that's happening at around the time when the paper is going to be ready. And then, okay, it's going to be presented at that conference, and then it will be published. Something that, I'll mention that after, but there are multiple things that also happen afterwards and things that you'll need to consider. But again, for my supervisors who are from that field, that was the meaningful output, right? Because in their field, conferences are the main thing. Journal articles usually are considered a secondary form of output, whereas for humanities, that's the other way around. And you've met Dan, who actually at UT advocated for recognizing conference papers in a similar way that journals are recognized in terms of how you are evaluated as an academic, but that's not always the case in every discipline, in every institution, right? So that's something that you need to consider really deeply, and perhaps that will also be dictating the amount of effort you will be giving to a certain output, right?
Absolutely, and this is an ongoing process of you articulating the importance of the venue, the prestige of the conference to those who might not be familiar with it in your discipline. So this is an ongoing conversation where kind of it's on you, if you're an interdisciplinary scholar, to explain why a certain output is extremely prestigious, or why the venue was chosen in favor of maybe some of the Q1 journals in your own field that you might have published in.
Yes, absolutely. Very good point.
Papers, more conference papers. Yes, we try to do one every year. They always attract a good audience. We have a great time at the Association of Internet Researchers Conference. This is actually a venue that we would recommend for computational social sciences, as Dan had mentioned yesterday.
Maybe if we could go back to that, I have one point that I wanted to make about AoIR. So it's interesting in the way that it's very interdisciplinary as a conference, right? It's a humanities conference in a way that they don't expect you to submit a full paper. They don't expect you to have the conference presentation as the final output. You can still, as a humanities scholar, use a conference as a way of getting some early feedback on the emergent work, kind of putting yourself out there, claiming, a little niche in the field and maybe connecting to other scholars. But AoIR also has still proceedings. So extended abstracts will be put out online and you can claim it as a research output. So I think, I don't really know the sort of logic behind that, but I have a feeling that maybe at some point the organizers of the conference wanted to accommodate the very interdisciplinary participants that they had and did it in a certain way. I really like that model, and yes, just to reiterate what Olga said, it's a really good venue to present at.
And it's kind of the best of both worlds because it is an archival conference, right? There are archival and non-archival conferences. So for archival conferences, the paper that you submit gets published. And then, when you're submitting the same paper to a journal, it has to be substantively different because you have published something before it counts as a publication. With AoIR, it's kind of a hybrid because it's an extended abstract. You could claim a new ground or test a new idea without actually compromising the journal article that you might be writing that this abstract might represent. So it's a little easier because you wouldn't have to rewrite the whole article if you have published something in AoIR. But at the same time, if you want to put your work out there, you will get a lot of citations, and this is a good way to just, if you need to get something out there fast or claim some kind of thing that you have discovered or want others to use.
Because yes, time that it takes to publish something is another factor that you really need to consider, and consider it early, right? Especially if once you've done with the PhD and you're trying to find a postdoc or get some funding that's related to a particular topic, but you also need to prove that you've done something on that topic. But how can you get the funding before you have done that, And it's a vicious circle, but something like that might be a way out and an early way of, like Olga says, claiming ground.
Or sometimes you might just be feeling curious and have a side quest that you are very eager to explore. And this is also a creative venue to get together with your friends or collaborators and just test out some ideas in this format, see if they're productive. And then if you decide to go on to a full paper, a lot of our papers started as AoIR submissions. And then we decided that there was enough scope to expand it to a proper article.
Absolutely.
So there's going to be 3 kind of sections to this session here. Research design, how to design a computational social science project, how to select a journal or a conference as a venue for it, and overall how to communicate your research, how to articulate your research in ways that are legible to your field, to others. So starting from designing your CSS project, interdisciplinarity is very much at the core of it, but what does it mean? We wanted to provide you with 3 examples of the research problem or a research question that we had, the data that we had for it, what we tried to do with it as a method, and what we ended up doing. So this is a bit of a story of, we tried but failed, but here's how we found a workaround. And I think this is something that we very rarely see in publications. In publications, it seems like it's very deliberate. We thought through an excellent research design from the beginning, and then it went smoothly from there. But that's not what real research process is like.
Yeah, absolutely. So think about it as a post-mortem of sorts. Sorry, I come from, I used to work in software, and I used to work for a company that looked at incidents or tried to help people manage their incidents with software. So for us, it was very common to analyze what happened and kind of think about better ways of doing things. So SICSS actually also does postmortems. After every SICSS, you're supposed to go back and look at what worked, what didn't work, and consider better ways forward. So postmortem is not a bad thing. It's a good thing.
Yeah, maybe we do wish that our field was more open about what it takes and what worked and how to go around if your methods don't work. So here's our first research question. What attributes do community members use to represent their identity online? So Kateryna has already mentioned about avatars that the members of the community that we studied used to represent their identity. donning an avatar, a Shiba Inu dog, a NAFO avatar, was a symbolic act of joining the community. And in time, in 2022, a lot of very prominent public personas, diplomats, have actually also swapped their formal avatars for one like this. The Australian ambassador to Ukraine, Bruce Edwards, actually got a note from DFAT being like, hey, we are the ones managing the Twitter account. You're not supposed to be swapping your photo with this, but he did it regardless. So that was a symbolic way of signaling your support for something, for Ukraine. But on the other hand, because they were so customized, we thought that is an excellent way of seeing what is meaningful to those users who feel compelled to join this movement, to swap their avatar. There were attributes that, they differed. There are so many different avatars, and they were all the same kind of template of the dog, but everything else was different. And here you see Gandalf being turned into an avatar. Gandalf with a watermelon, which was the symbol of Kherson, where Kateryna is from. And so when Kherson got liberated by the Ukrainian army, there was a big celebration of that event, and a lot of people felt like they were having a pumpkin cocktail. Does that capture?
That's correct. Yes, yeah.
And I'm just certain that this is Gandalf and not Dumbledore, as I had I once misspoke in one of the presentations, and that caused quite a lot of Q&A afterwards. So. Just making sure that I don't, misspeak this time. Okay, so we had 5,737 tweets where users were requesting an avatar to be forged for them. That's the group kind of slang for manufacturing an avatar. So to become a NAFO fella, so NAFO is North Atlantic Fellows Organization. It's reminiscent of NATO, but not quite. It's like the People's NATO, collective defense online against Russian disinformation and various other harmful things that the users thought to combat, as they realized that a lot of disinformation was not captured by moderation, by fact checking. And so they saw their kind of mission to combat disinformation online and to generate support for Ukraine. And so to request an avatar, one had to make a donation to any Ukrainian charity and screenshot the donations as you see here. So somebody donated $30 to a person collecting donations and had requested an avatar that looked like Gandalf is having a watermelon cocktail. And so yes, the tweets were collected using the hashtag fellow request, which was the proper way of doing that. And we thought, how do we get at the attributes that people consider meaningful and important in displaying their identity and kind of displaying distinction in this very uniform Shiba Inu dog space. And then Kateryna had an idea of doing a feature extraction, so running all these 5,000 images through Google Glass. Did you want to?
That's right. So that's kind of, maybe there are better ways to do it, and there are definitely better ways to do it. One of them being Image Machine, for example, which we also tried. You'll learn about Image Machine, and I think Dan spoke about it, but it's a way of clustering images based on their visual characteristics. We've actually tried that as well with this data set, but what didn't work was that if you see these types of images, right, they kind of, and if you can imagine that everybody's requesting these avatars, what Image Machine did, it separated screenshots and everything else really well, but then getting to actually understanding what the objects were, whether people were, using an image of a watermelon or a particular type of a hat, the way that was represented by people was very different. So the clustering wasn't really meaningful.
It wasn't meaningful because we got a list of attributes like dog, hand, hat. It's like, yeah, we know it's a dog and we know they have a hand, but what are they holding in their hand? Why is this significant? We didn't know why. It didn't really show us why.
Absolutely. And to get to that, we had to do, so the Image Machine is the visual clustering where you kind of do sort of like a topic modeling, a visual similarity of images. And then Google Glass is something that annotates your data, right, and gives it a little label and extracts those types of things that are present in an image. And like Arabi was saying, right, it probably is trained on types of data sets that some of them might come from capture, where this is how road crossing looks like, and so on and so forth. So the model trained on that will look at your image and output the types of things that are on it. And like Olga said, it was, yes, hand, face, dog, hat, but that wasn't really helpful or meaningful for us. So we actually established a workaround.
yeah, so we thought, how else can we analyze this data set and understand and extract features out of it that are meaningful to us for our purpose? And then we realized that when the user is requesting an avatar, they are actually describing it in plain language. And we thought, oh, okay, so we actually have the user-generated description of what they want on the avatar. That's really helpful. And so we did a semantic network, which is my kind of go-to whenever in doubt, generate a network. So we thought, oh, can we generate a network? And we generated, this is basically a heat map, but it represents a semantic network where the attributes, the nouns were stripped from the tweets. And then if the two nouns occur within the same tweet, they get a connection between them. And then you can see how they are represented as a network, with the most frequently used attributes being at the center, and then the ones that they're related to being closely kind of linked to them. So, and the bigger the node, sort of the more frequent that attribute was used. And yeah, there are a lot of things in this heat map that we thought was very interesting, like the kind of uniformity of it, that there are a lot of attributes, flag, uniform, there are very uniform imagery per se. There are a lot of national attributes. There are other attributes there are gender attributes that were important to users. So guy, and there's also, so they would say, make me a guy holding something, something. There would be attributes that they're holding. So Ukrainian flag, katana, weapon. So there are really interesting, because even though they were uniform, there were important distinctions in how the users chose to self-represent. And that was a very productive way to analyze those attributes and what matters to them.
Absolutely. And I think I'd like to add that also, to me, that was a more meaningful way of getting to identity, because we were looking at how people describe themselves, right? So it was their own, that sort of hopefully allowed us to better preserve their self-representation, because we were looking at their sort of way of describing, because finding a screenshot and putting it out there might not be the best representation.
Yeah, and that also got at a lot of theoretical questions in our field. One of them is the sort of connective action paradigm, which a lot of you might be familiar with, which is saying that brick and mortar organizations don't matter as much in the digital age, that people can, network online and achieve the same collective action goals while they're united as an online community. And for a lot of the time, so since 2013, since that paper, that's Bennett and Segerberg, since it published, there was some kind of skepticism, right? So people, there can be some online only action, but what do people really do? We really need organizations. And I think with NAFO, it provided such a different example of a collective that's networked completely online, but that has a feasible material benefit. And so that was something that has captivated us and really led us to research them, because we thought they provided a very interesting case that is ongoing, that's really very sizable in terms of the member size. It's 100,000 people on any given time. And a kind of a very interesting case to sort of expand our understanding of an existing theory. And then there's a lot of literature that's talking about like the online and offline divide. People do this online, but what do they do offline? And this kind of pushed against that in very productive ways. And that's Kateryna's interest in kind of not only communications, but behaviors. What behaviors underpin the kind of communicative tip of the iceberg that we're seeing was really something that drove this. And so our takeaway is look for workarounds. There usually is more than one way to approach the solution. If you try something and it doesn't work, maybe try something else or find other ways to get at what interests you. Second story is the non-human humanitarians. So this is a classification exercise. This was a paper that we looked at. So in 2023, the Russian armed forces had mined and exploded a massive dam that's in Ukraine's south, the Kakhovka Dam. It was a big, one of the biggest environmental crises of the 21st century. And it caused extensive flooding of a lot of territory. It caused droughts on the rest of the territory. Maybe Kateryna would like to say a little bit more about it, just because it's
right, absolutely. And
Yep.
I think the case is so significant is because it happened on the territory that was occupied by Russian forces. So access of journalists was very difficult. It was really hard to understand what was happening on the ground. And even the impact, the way we understand it now, is very partial, because we only can measure and calculate the things that happened on the Ukrainian liberated territories. We still don't know a lot of the time what happened on the occupied territories, or what we know might not be capturing the full extent of the destruction.
Yeah, and so we caught ourselves witnessing helplessly this massive environmental disaster unfolding on social media and elsewhere, and we just thought that it is our duty to collect the data and to see kind of what was happening around that incident. So we started collecting the data from a day kind of, well, retroactively. Okay, we didn't start it before it happened. We collected our data from 1 day before to 10 days after, and we collected it across 3 social media platforms. So that was Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. At the time, that was still possible. This is the golden age of the pre-API.
Very last days of that golden era. It was literally when Elon Musk already announced that he's going to be closing the Twitter API, but it was still working. They said that it was closing down, but you could still get the data. So
and Meta closed CrowdTangle 2
yeah.
months after we collected this. So this was really one of the few last opportunities to do this. But yes, we really wanted to see how this witnessing was taking place. What were people talking about? Our first questions were kind of exploratory, like what were the patterns of conversation? What images did people think necessary to share with regard to this? We were also very disappointed with international media coverage of the incident at the time, because most of those articles were like Ukraine and Russia accuse each other of, and we didn't know. So there was a lot of kind of whodunit discussion without kind of highlighting the environmental impacts, and without highlighting the fact that a lot of rescue and evacuation efforts are needed, that there were people really drowning and a kind of whole huge, thousands of square kilometers of land being flooded, and that Russia was not evacuating people from those territories at all. And anyway, there were, at the backdrop of this kind of whodunit discussion, there was also a massive grassroots effort to raise funds to buy inflatable boats, any kind of transport equipment to perform the rescue operations. And there were a lot of volunteers just doing whatever they could to rescue people, livestock, pets, and et cetera, et cetera. And so our first questions, I guess we started very kind of broadly, and we thought, oh, what are people talking about? And we did a topic modeling using BERT.
That's right.
Yeah. And would you like to, yeah, so we had 10 categories, right?
Yes, so I think one important thing that I think Olga should mention, because that's her big take, is that we did topic modeling, but our data set was already topical in a way, right? So that's a big limitation.
Yes, because the way we collected our data set was we had a few hashtags. We had Kherson or Kakhovka, and so we collected 150,000 posts across the 3 platforms. And we thought maybe topic modeling would help us kind of disentangle some of those conversations. And we did also the same with the images. So we have collected another data set of just the imagery, and we tried doing image machine on like clustering the output to see what sorts of images proliferate on social media. That's another question in itself. It's a very interesting question. Actually, Len was part of an offshoot of that project where we looked at those images for a different reason, for a different project. But in any case, we saw a few dominant genres, but we realized that only a few images that were captured from above, from the drone, got to represent pretty much the majority of the environmental devastation. So it was just the same image kind of reproduced, reprinted. So sometimes it had words on it, sometimes it didn't. And we thought, wow, an accident that's impossible to witness by humans because it's impossible physically to get there is pretty much represented by 2 images or 3 images. But then we also saw a proliferation of animal imagery featuring animals. And we thought that was really interesting because animals helped tell the story of this large-scale environmental devastation in a way that kind of allowed to, even at the time when nothing was established, it was not known what really happened, they already were the ones who were harmed by the incident. They were the ones who could help people tell the story of a massive kind of devastation happening there. And we thought that was an interesting topic to look into. And we have read up. So this is a different case, right? With the NAFO before, we kind of knew what questions we had because that literature was already very solid. So we were driven by a question that was very much driven by the literature. Here we were like, we're seeing a lot of animals. What does it mean? What does it mean when animals are used to tell the story? And so we have looked at different literature, and one of the very productive areas was that of non-human humanitarianism, of there being a non-human turn in environmental humanities, where animals and other non-human actors are positioned. You know, there's a lot of it investigates the agency that a lot of these animals have in disasters. How do they work together with humans? And for our purpose, we were really interested, how do they help to, what are their role in those narratives? What do animals do when something like that happens? And so that's what ended up being a research question. What role do animals play in translating large-scale crises across the social media ecosystem? And we also thought that it's really interesting that the ecosystem and the social media ecosystem, there's really interesting theoretical contribution there about the social media ecosystem being actually part of, you know, our mediated environment. So we had one wet dog, which was this dog taken by my colleague who's a war journalist in the area. And we had these posts from platforms. This is how kind of they happened across time. So a lot of posts in the first day, in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, and then fewer posts in the subsequent days. And we tried the topic modeling approach. We even tried hierarchical clustering, where we would have the LLM sort of separate all of the posts into 10 different categories. And then we tried going from there and seeing if there are subsequent subclusters. And so once we had solidified our research question, animals, right? There's got to be a cluster that has all of the animals in it, right? That makes sense. You did topic modeling, so all of the animal posts should be in one of the clusters. And we looked at one of the clusters, we found the animals, we're like, yay, that's where all the animals are at. And then we looked at other clusters, and the animals were there as well. And the animals were present across almost all of the clusters that our topic model has defined for us. So on one hand, you could say, oh wow, our topic modeling is clearly not great. If it cannot separate animal-related posts from the other posts, we have a problem. But that wasn't our takeaway. We thought if the animals are present across so many different clusters, that means they're talked about in very different ways. That might mean that the narratives that they're involved in are very different. And so that was actually exciting for us. To think what that might mean. What are some of the different ways that the animals might be sort of behaving in those narratives? And so Kateryna and I went to our reliable method of very kind of social science kind of training, and we did content analysis. But before that, we used we separated. So we found other ways. I think was word embeddings that we.
It was word embeddings.
Yeah.
So all the words that were seen as related in a vector space to the word animal. That was our way of separating animal posts from non-animal posts. Of course, you still need to establish the threshold of that similarity that's meaningful, because in a vector space, everything is related to everything, right? But you need to find a meaningful way of slicing that. And we also did that through validation by us, the two coders, who then decided on the appropriate threshold.
Yeah, so we have kind of ranked all the posts based on their semantic similarity to the word animal. And then we identified a threshold where above the threshold, the majority of the posts were animal related, and below the threshold, the majority were not. So to avoid kind of false positives and false negatives, we tried to kind of minimize them in our data set. And we ended up with a smaller data set with just animal-related posts. And then we did the social science thing, which we took a random 5% of the sample, and we content analyzed it by ourselves. We used the categories that emerged in the literature on non-human humanitarianism, and we kind of saw, we were interested in three things. What kind of an animal does the post talk about? What is the animal doing in the post? And then what practice does that represent? And I think we don't have
the practice, but we have what the animals.
But we have what the animals are and what they're doing. So so as you see, we had zoo animals, pets, humans as animals. There was also a kind of derogatory term, animals, to signify humans. Hedgehog, fish, farm animal, dog, deer, cat, bird, beaver, and also an unspecified animal where people said something like animals are, a lot of animals have died, for example. And then dying or being killed, being rescued, struggling or being threatened, starving, swimming or floating, drowning, committing war crimes. So this was kind of this really helped us understand, what kinds of animals are we talking about, what are they doing, and what it was Kateryna's framework that we used there, what the doing does. Do you want to explain a little?
Just really briefly, if you are looking to think about what discursive practices are, you need to think about the intention of someone who's engaged in that and also the impact that it might have on the broader community. So that's what we were trying to get at.
Yeah. So we saw things like witnessing. The animals were as witnesses of the disaster, or the animals were used to mobilize support or to mobilize fundraising or to mobilize people to engage in a certain act. And that was the key takeaway from the paper. But the key takeaway for computational methods is that in the LLM era, content analysis is still key. Sometimes that's what you need to do, but you can also make your work easier. For example, for us to separate animal-related posts from non-animal-related posts, we could automate that part. So you can automate some parts and do, analyze them qualitatively as relevant. The third story is that on participatory war. So this was the chapter that we have written with Kateryna. We wanted to see, the idea of participatory war is that anyone with a internet-connected device can participate in changing the course and the outcomes of wars because of the ways that the digital ecosystem also doubles up, in wars, as it has dual use, and every civilian that's posting something about the war is embedding themselves in this ecosystem and potentially also risking their life by doing so. So we wanted to look at the war and media publications by year. This was our semi-automated literature review, querying Google Scholar and the Web of Science.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, to retrieve those articles and then but through content analysis, again, classifying them as non-participatory or participatory. Does it talk about the ways that the users can engage in this context or not? And then from there, we came we have constructed what we call a diffraction model of participatory war, which is essentially the various sets of behaviors that can occur at the backdrop of war. So there's direct combat in the middle, which is, of course, the main kind of action that happens during a war, but there's also things like military crowdfunding and drone warfare that is sort of adjacent to direct combat, but that civilians can actually engage in. And then there's more like cyber attacks, humanitarian aid, crowdsourcing, open source intelligence that is kind of another layer of, it's removed by another layer, but still has significance in the military domain. And then there's a lot of information kind of based operations, curation, propaganda, political satire, mobilization, advocacy. So there are a lot of things that internet users could do surrounding some of those more direct things. And for us, we had an interest. So how do those participatory war modalities relate to each other? So we found all of them in the literature. They're grounded in every one of these papers. But then which ones of them co-occur, which ones relate to the other ones? So we had 130 sources. We had 17 modalities. We tried analyzing them qualitatively, but it still kind of doesn't help us understand the relationship between them. And so we generated a network as a way to show which ones co-occur with which. And so we noticed that witnessing and storytelling is massively central here. And of course, you can also use, once you generate a network, you can use network analysis parameters to actually empirically establish the centrality of something. So we don't eyeball it when we generate a network. We just generate it as a visual representation, and then we analyze it as a network. So documenting and moderation, information curation, propaganda, and you see these kind of information-related behaviors as central in this literature, and that was something that we thought a network is particularly helpful in, because even if you have a table of activities, it still doesn't allow you to see the relationship between the attributes, whereas a network is really good for that. And so this is just to say you can use computational methods to complement qualitative analysis. You don't need to have a social media, a data set that's collected on social media to use computational methods. Sometimes you can use it even on your content analysis. Whenever, yeah, so you can make a network out of anything. Doesn't mean that you should, but sometimes it's really helpful. So this is just a kind of to wrap up, designing a computational social science project. So the two distinctions between representations and operations. So you can work with different kinds of data. You can work with big data. You can work with small data. Yesterday, we talked about ready-made data and curated or custom-made data. So there are different kinds of data sets that you can use to then use computational approaches or the traditional social scientific approaches. And you can, use traditional approaches on a big data set. You can use computational approaches on a small data. You are not bound to use one or the other method just because of the nature of your data set, but you have to be mindful about how your data was collected so that you choose the methods that's most appropriate to your research question, but also to the type of data that you have. Designing a CSS project. So those are our tips. You can, have your own, or we can, we're happy to discuss them, but basically keep your eye on the research question, not the method. Sometimes you really want to use some method. And I think that was us with the topic modeling. We were so excited to have Bert just go into our data set and show us what kinds of topics there are represented. And then we realized upon looking closely into the data, we realized they weren't topic in what we humans mean by topics. And also an important caveat about the concept of topic, because if you collect a data set that's collected by a single hashtag, if a data set is defined by a single term, it by default belongs to a single topic. So if you do a topic modeling on something that it belongs to a single topic by definition, things will likely get messy. You can claim that those are subtopics, but they will still be very much interlinked. And so this is something that we found in practice, is that it's sometimes really helpful to find subtopics within a topic, but usually you would need to do a lot of fine-tuning of your model before you can reliably say that it's actually finding the things that you claim that it's finding. Inductive plus deductive equals productive. It's also sometimes called abductive, but that sounds like you're kidnapping someone. So, yeah. And then if your selected method doesn't work, tweak it or look for workarounds. That's always the kind of the mentality. And finally, always check the validity of your findings. This is something that every computational social science paper needs to contain. So external validity, right? How well your data represents the outside world. If it doesn't, if it's selective, I think Arabi talked about it yesterday really well. So don't make claims about the society if you study Twitter. That very much holds. Internal validity is how much does your model actually represent the data that you have? How, if you claim that there are 10 topics within the data, is that really the case? How do you define the topics? Why this way and not the other way? And then construct validity is about the actual concepts that you're measuring. And this is where your social science training is really helpful, because you need to really be able to articulate which concepts you are trying to measure. If you have variables, which variables are they do they serve as proxy for? You have to be really clear in those things to really make sure that this validity is something that your reviewers will look for, that your examiners will look for. This is something that you absolutely need to think about when you're designing your project.
All right, so we promised to talk about publishing, and this is all, of course, very relevant. All these methodological choices sometimes might be also dictated by, or quite often will be dictated by, the outlet that you're hoping to target. So I'd like to start from just stating this as a very useful resource. Some of you might know, but I highly recommend this book, Writing Your Journal Article in 12 Weeks. Sometimes I refer to it as the Bible, because I go back to it a lot. And one of the main things that you'll get out of this book is the idea of argument, right? So it's a word that we understand without needing a definition, but argument is a new claim that your article will make that is related to the key debates in a field, that is supported by the findings or is connected to the findings of your project. So this book is really good at getting you to actually articulate that argument. and communicate it in a journal article format. Again, this will be more relevant to humanities, but any field or any yes, even more computational fields or outputs like conference papers also have arguments, because what we are trying to do as scientists is to advance human knowledge, right? And it will always be done through an argument. So quite often when you submit an article, you might be rejected. You might be rejected for different reasons. You might be told that this is too descriptive or this is not novel enough. And in fact, I think an early version of our project on the Kakhovka Dam was rejected
because of being descriptive. Because
Exactly.
It was descriptive. What topics do people talk about online with regard to this crisis? Absolutely descriptive. Didn't connect to enough debates in the field to make a meaningful contribution, and the reviewers criticized it for exactly that reason.
No, they didn't tell us that it was because they didn't like the argument or because we were lacking the argument, but ultimately that's what it was, right? We did not have this novel contribution that was connected to our findings and to the debates in the field yet, but we got there in the end. So again, very important resource to help you understand that argument. Another thing that might be useful is the thematic and methodological alignment with a particular journal or conference. For one field, you might not have an argument because you might be talking about something that's already been established in that field. For another field, you might be doing an amazing contribution and something that hasn't really been done. Of course, you need to do it in a careful way and connect to the debates in that field, but you might have an opportunity, right? So, for example, the question that Olga said, is it a methods paper? It may be a methods paper for a different discipline or a different outlet.
Or even our contribution to non-human humanitarianism, our media studies journals didn't like that. They said, is it a thing? What's novel here? Whereas more international studies literature on humanitarianism loved it, because that talks to what is important for them. So that's also sometimes when somebody says, oh, that's not interesting, that might be an issue of thematic or methodological misalignment with what how the field sees itself. And so keep that in mind, because if you're convinced that this is interesting, but your reviewers think otherwise, maybe you need to look for a different venue.
Right. And then important things to consider aside from that, of course, is when you're choosing a journal or a conference, you need to think about the impact that it's going to be making. So you may have heard about metrics like an impact factor, or in humanities, often we talk about quartiles. You know, everyone wants to get into a Q1 journal. Sometimes you get into a Q2 journal, you want to avoid the Q4 journals, and so on and so forth. Talk to your supervisors or someone more experienced in the field about that. For conferences, computer science conferences, they are more likely to be talking about rankings. So CORE is a website where you can check a ranking of a conference, and they start from A star and they go A, B, C, and so on and so forth. So A star is the highest. It might be a bit of a gamble in terms of which impact factor to go for. Some very impactful journals might take a really long time to get to a review. Even if you are accepted, the processing times might be very, very long, so something to consider as well.
And also in some of the fields, there are no Q1 journals. And if that's the case with your field, you will need to just articulate that to whoever will be assessing the quality of your research. Because I didn't know it was a thing when I started my career at Sydney. And then somebody made a comment, and it used to be like, oh, my friends are doing a special issue, or the cool folks I met at a conference are doing a special issue. Yay, I'll contribute to it. And so I wasn't really strategic in where my outputs appeared. And I think not until somebody made a comment like, you should really have a strategy to publish in higher impact journals, I realized that it was really significant. So right now, when we report on our year, we do mark that for our supervisor, for our managers. That's a very important thing. And if you have a solo publication in a Q1 journal, that really positions you well for the job market, for the academic job market. So just keep that in mind as you decide on your venue.
But again, if you are going to join a computer science department, they might not care about that at all, because for them, journals is something that's secondary level output, right? They will care about conferences. So that's something to keep in mind. Review times can be very long. Some have some journals are very, very selective about the articles that they publish, but they might have a benefit of having a very fast desk review process. So where an editor will look at your journal really, really fast and hopefully, maybe, accept it, but more likely reject it. And in that case, fast desk reject, the fact that your article was rejected really, really fast is a plus, because you can then resubmit it to another journal, that's an opportunity and something that you should consider as something that is good. So staying positive there. Some scholars that I know actually have a strategy of, we will start with this particular journal because it's a very high-ranking journal. We're probably going to get desk rejected, so then we're going to go to this other one. So you may be changing your manuscript to fit the standards of that journal, right? So they may be using a Sage Harvard referencing style, and then the other journal might be using APA. So we highly recommend that you need to use reference management software to be able to do that fast.
Always, please. It takes a while to set up, but it pays off. You will just really thank yourself, this version of yourself that set it up, because having to reformat your references, especially like between computer science and social science venues, is a nightmare. Never do it manually. Always do it automatically through software like Zotero. Befriend Zotero early on. Keep your research, your reference library in it. You can, keep it kind of in different folders by topic, as you organize it as you want, but this is something to really be working on. It's almost like it's your library in a citation management software.
And just in the spirit of the post-mortem, I think with the non-human humanitarians projects, we tried, I think, 3 journals until we got accepted to get that past desk review. So it might take a few tries, and that's okay.
You'll need to reformat your article every time, because even it's like Harvard or Chicago or APA.
Absolutely. And then lastly, hopefully you get accepted. So then there are still things that you will need to consider. One of them is article processing charges, APCs. Luckily now Australia has very good system where a lot of universities have agreements with publishers. That's done through the Australian Council of Librarians, if I'm not mispronouncing the name of the organization. So sometimes you will be able to get that open access fee covered through those agreements, but not always. So you might have to pay out of pocket if you want to keep your research open access.
And some of them are prohibitively expensive. We're talking about $8,000. So it's like you could have bought a used car or published an article in the journal of your choice. Just keep that in mind, even as you submit, because that really makes a difference. And if your university has an agreement with one of these publishers, maybe that is a very pragmatic way to get your work published open access, because that really makes a difference in who's going to access it, who's going to cite it. If you really are looking to get it out there to the maximum number of people, that's a much better way to go, and really consider that when you make that choice.
And speaking about prohibitive things, computer science conferences are expensive. And if you want to be published in the computer science conference, you have to attend that conference. So you need to consider those attendance costs. They also go in thousands of dollars. Even if you do it online, it may be quite expensive. And actually faced that problem with my article that was published in the Computational Linguistics conference. I totally did not think about that. But yes, even to attend remotely, I had to spend a few $100s. Luckily, I still had research funds and I was able to cover that. But still, you've gone through all this work, peer review process and everything, but there's still a thing to consider, and that's the attendance costs.
I covered my first article publication charge out of pocket. I do not recommend it. Don't do it. It's silly.
Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so some of the things will also inform your write-up. We already talked about the citation management software, but we'll also need to discuss authorship. We already covered that, but all of these things that you need to consider, who's going to be attending a conference if you're accepted, who can cover, the article processing charges. These all is a factor to consider when you discuss the authorship, order, the responsibilities that come with it.
And this is an ongoing conversation. So it's not like you discuss the authorship order early on and then you stick with it. Sometimes it might be that you contribute more or less to the paper in its final form, and then it's a good idea to revisit that conversation or to establish the criteria and the expectations from each of the co-authors. You also probably saw those memes when there was a lot of people pushing a car and there's somebody standing on top. So, the 11th co-author that really hasn't contributed a lot. So, you have that conversation. It's really a good practice to discuss it early. What can you expect when joining the project? What can your collaborators expect?
Another thing that is really, really useful, and a word that I learned from Olga is manuscripts.
Manuscripts. Don't throw away your writing. If your paper takes a different term, but you've already written, a literature review for something else, store it. Maybe you can turn another paper, churn another paper out of it, or something. Just have manuscripts when you work on something. They might be useful. You never know.
Great. And then one thing that, again, is more practical and at the stage of actually writing up the final product, or maybe one of the final products, one of the versions of that product, is the need to follow the conventions of that particular field. And sometimes it's easier said than done, because for some things, of course, you will be able to look up, yes, the reference management style and other things, or how to do certain things, what's the word lengths, but other things are more of an unsaid practice, right? So for example, in computer science and computational linguistics, it's very conventional to have a figure on the first page of your paper. Like, there must be a figure. You cannot, like, it's not a rule, but there has to be a figure if you want to get accepted. So one of my supervisors had to tell me that. And that comes from actually more medical and biochemistry fields, but computer science, you need to have that figure. No one tells you that unless they do. So again, the value of academic grapevine is also something that is really important. Okay, next one. We're almost out of time, but we have some means.
Yeah, Kateryna, I'll give it to you. These are self-explanatory slides on how to incorporate very helpful reviewer feedback. Sometimes it can appear schizophrenic. So just a reminder to you that, like with the ethics application, you are the one in the driver's seat. It is up to you to explain to the reviewers why you will or will not do certain things that they are requesting. And it's okay if you say, sorry, but this is outside the scope of the study. Or saying something like, we have done this study, this is coming up, or this is a separate study, or any kind of things that you don't feel compelled when the reviewer tells you to do something. You don't. It's not like you must do that, because otherwise you'll end up with this beautiful eclectic pizza. And then constructive encouragement. I'll skip this. I'll just say a lot of the times we are getting told that, oh, this is so jargony. Oh, can you avoid jargon? And once I had to avoid jargon when I was explaining the Fruchterman-Reingold algorithm, which is basically a network visualization algorithm. So I was like, how do I explain it in plain terms? This is like an algorithm. So I explained it like a carousel. It's like, we are going to spin our network, and then it's going to take a certain shape. And so hence the head spinning GIF on the right. But yeah, you can read. There's some words of love from our reviewers saying, this method doesn't make sense. I hate your graph. Can you just do it in a different way? That happens.
Right, but there is a way forward, and you can do it. This is my words of encouragement, not from reviewer two. I was lucky to attend SICSS Sydney and meet some of my research collaborators. Not all of them, one of them is missing from the photo, but they're all really wonderful. And we managed to develop a project together. It was focusing on discussions around COVID-19 philanthropy in the context of the African continent. It sort of started from some frustrations that our group members had, and it evolved into several presentations. Some of them were more methodological, some of them were more humanities. We finally arrived at a good way, at a good argument that contributed to the field, and we got it published after several years. So people were born. Some of us had kids during that time. So it took a lot of time and effort, but we got there. So there is definitely a way forward if you collaborate joyfully.
Yeah, so just a reminder that SICSS is also a research incubator. Use that opportunity wisely. You might get a publication out of it. That's the goal. And yeah, research rigorously, collaborate joyfully, and like one of the Ukrainian scholars said, "Буйно мрійте," which is dream unabashedly. So that is our message to you today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
We got 10 minutes for some questions. Probably 2 or 3 questions would be great. Got any?
You can also ask us in person in the spirit of friendship as method.
Follow up. Your own ideas, your own experiences about research.
I love the idea of manuscripts, by the way. That's fantastic. Really, really good one. Yeah, okay. So publishing, any advice on how to deal with the reviewer feedback? Because I understand it's got a certain political element to it as well.
Sometimes you receive the reviewer feedback. You have like rage, you want to close your laptop, and maybe that's the right thing to do. So don't respond to it. Don't feel tempted to respond to it immediately. Sometimes you need to let that settle in and kind of address it in a calm manner. And sometimes you get absolutely infuriating reviewer feedback and you say, oh, they don't get it. They absolutely missed the whole thing. Who is this even? And we've all got feedback like that. That's probably, it's not, as long as it's not offensive, it's normal. And I think maybe not taking it personally and trying to really engage that reviewer in a discussion is a productive way to go. Whether you are able to do it on the day or you need to let it set aside for a week and then come back to it and then kind of. So I think that's one of the kind of don't go with your first instinct. Sometimes what they're suggesting might not be harmful. Like I said, you can decide not to do it, or you can decide they're rage baiting you and just not engage with them. But most likely they are trying to make your study better. We've actually made some substantive revisions to all of our papers as a result of reviewer input. We think it's really what signals the rigor. Sometimes they would say, oh, you need to add a whole new paragraph of your methods description. Kateryna once addressed one of the reviewer comments in adding a whole paragraph on how our sample was selected and went into the nitty-gritty of it. We had a stratified sample and we did a random 1%, and here's what we did. And the reviewer was so happy. And so we think that, that actually makes your paper better. But yeah, what I would say, just approach it with kind of generosity. Hopefully they also approach it with generosity. I was also an editor of a journal for a few years, and I have made conscious attempts, if I thought that the reviewer input was not helpful or was in some ways a little, mismatched, I sometimes even removed it or edited parts of it just so that it's not hard on the author. But yeah, overall, engage with it constructively, calmly, and if you refuse to do some of the things, explain your decision to the reviewers.
You'll develop your own approaches, but my coping mechanism is to make an Excel spreadsheet. So I get that wall of text from the reviewers, and then after I've taken a break and a breath, I open up an Excel and I try and break the review down into simple sentences. So just really 1 or 2 points that they're making. And then I'm simplifying that even further. So I'm trying to rephrase what the reviewer is saying to me into more simple words in terms of what they want me to do, because sometimes they might phrase it in a very annoying way or something that's hurtful. I don't want to be looking at that. I want to be looking at something that's actionable. So I'm making another column that really distills that down to one action item. And then I go and do the thing, and then after that I write a response, and then I remove some of those columns and I submit that together with my revised paper as something that an editor sometimes would want to look at, and the reviewers as well, which is a revisions table.
Yes. Revisions table or a very comprehensive reviewer response. If you don't have one, it's really helpful to look at a few. So if your supervisor can share one from their work, how they address it, this is usually like, we thank the 3 reviewers for their very useful, constructive and generous feedback on our work, and then everything. And you do, so it has to have a certain tone to make sure it's not, aggressive. It has to have explain the changes, pointed them to the changes, on which pages have you made those changes, what have you reconsidered as a result, and sometimes the journal asks you to highlight all of the things that have been changed in the paper. So writing a really good response is one way to communicate back to the reviewers what you have that you've really considered, and sometimes they will go back saying, the authors have considered these comments but have not addressed this one, and then you address it in the subsequent revisions.
Also, some examples are in this book. There is the table template, and there are also there is a chapter on responding to reviewers. So highly recommend looking at this again.
Fantastic. And then I guess I'll ask my own questions. We don't have time for questions. I guess there's also this issue that we discussed yesterday, perhaps single authorship. What's your view on that? Because single authorship takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So you design the entire study yourself, and you invest a lot of thought and effort into this. You find your own methods, and then you submit it to a journal, and then you need to face all the revisions yourself. And on the other hand, you have co-authorship, right? So you have people that you collaborate with. You kind of, there's this division of labor. You kind of, one person does this, one person does that. Is being a single author really beneficial in your mind, in your opinion, or is it always better to just go down the collaboration track?
I'll go ahead and say yes. Being a single author is still considered valuable in our field, at least, and that might be different in your fields. But I think in the humanities and social sciences, that is still that remains the standard by which your work is judged. If you've produced a doctoral thesis, that's an accomplishment. But then if you've also published as a solo author, that is the quality of your work. So that's a very different way to assess. And I think, yes, I think that's still the advice, and maybe Kateryna has defended her thesis later than I have, so maybe that advice is changing over the years, but that very much remains the thing. Have a good solo authored publication in a high quality journal that really sets you up nicely for your subsequent career.
I think in the humanities that indeed is still the case. And again, this is the grapevine type of advice, right? No one will explicitly tell you that unless they will.
But people who will sit down with you and tell you that,
they are the important sources that you should listen to. But in terms of the procedures, for example, thesis by publication now accepts co-authored papers, right? And the student can be a first co-author or even the secondary author, depends on your institution. So it definitely is becoming more of a trend in the humanities, but still there is this, kind of image related to it, right? So I think that's what Bogdan was referring to as well. One more thing to keep in mind as well, working in interdisciplinary teams, sometimes some people would expect you to be an author, even though they may not have contributed any writing, right? So in the humanities, usually someone has to write at least a part of a manuscript to be considered an author. In fields like computer science, they will not have that expectation. Instead, being a part of a sort of data collection team, or even being sort of somehow involved in conceptualizing.
Or being on the grant, the team that applies for a grant. So there's a very senior scholar who leads a discovery application, for example, with the Australian Research Council. They get the grant, and that senior scholar, without that scholar, nothing would have happened. So they get to be put on publications as a co-author in science. That's the norm, because without them, none of this ecosystem would have existed. So there's very different criteria. They're discipline specific. There's not one right way to go about it. But when I was a PhD student, I was a research assistant on a massive externally funded project, and I actually got myself into a huge trouble by collaborating with a few of my colleagues within that team. We kind of had a side offshoot. We had a big data set, and we thought, we can also ask this creative question, and all of the other colleagues were not interested in that. So we thought we'll just get together, submit an abstract to a conference, and then we got into a huge trouble because everybody else said, why are we not co-authors on this? And so be sure that you understand the requirements. Don't get in trouble. It's
And sometimes, like Olga said, you need to be the one who communicates that. As an interdisciplinary scholar in the room, you might have to explain that, okay, in this particular field, there is an expectation that a student should have a solo author, and the PhD supervisors will not be co-authors just because they are PhD supervisors, right? So if you are an interdisciplinary scholar in the room, do take some time to explain that to people who may not be familiar with those conventions.
Yeah, and also get a mentor. Your PhD supervisor is really well positioned to help you as you're publishing your first article. Like I said, in some fields, they then expect, if they've had a substantive contribution to your article, they would expect probably to be named as author. So some of them would do it out of the goodness of their own heart. If you say, well, I'm publishing this as a side interest, or I'm publishing this project, can you help look at my reviewer response? Well, by that, you would have to provide them with drafts, and they can just provide input. So they're not going to help you write it, but at least consulting someone. But also get a mentor, find scholars in your field who you can, who can read it and give you feedback. That is really helpful, and you might, end up working with that person. So at the academic grapevine, I think it also doubles up as a kind of powerful support network, mentorship network that can help you go through some of those obligatory rites of passage as a scholar. It doesn't need to be your supervisor, it can be.
And hopefully SICSS is a good place to find that mentor if you don't yet have one. People who will come and be speakers here are people who, found times in their day to actually go and come and speak to junior scholars. So they're probably people who are quite welcoming and generous with their time. So do talk to them and approach them in that way.
Absolutely. You can approach them just as long as you are very clear about what it is that you want and you're showing enough, so that they can make a decision. That would be really a good practice to reach.
I guess it's important to collaborate, but it's also important to show that you can produce some independent work.
Yep.
Okay, let's have some rest. Thank you. Thanks, Olga, Kateryna. Last session. Please be seated.